The wild geese were coming back from the Southland. They flew overhead from one lake to the other, where they rested on the water and fed along the shores. The ground was bare of snow, and although the nights were cold and the wind often chilly, the sunshine was warm and spring had come. Manly was getting his plows and harrows in order for working the land to be ready for sowing of wheat and oats. He must get an early start at the work, for there were 100 acres to sow in wheat and a 50-acre oat field on the homestead. At the shanty of the homestead, Laura held the grain sacks while he shoveled the wheat into them. He was hauling them to the home barn to be handy for the sowing. The shanty was cold. The grain sacks were coarse and rough to the touch, and the wheat was dusty. Watching the plump wheat kernels slide into the open mouth of the sack made Laura dizzy. If she took her eyes from them, they were drawn irresistibly to the newspapers pasted on the shanty walls, and she read the words over and over. She was unreasonably annoyed because some of them were bottom side up, but she must read them anyway. She couldn't take her eyes from them. Words, words. The world was full of words and sliding wheat kernels. And then she heard Manly saying, "Sit down a minute, you're tired." So she sat down, but she was not tired. She was sick. The next morning, she felt much worse, and Manly got his own breakfast. For days, she fainted whenever she left her bed. The doctor told her to lie quietly. He assured her she would feel much better before long, and that in a few months, 9 to be exact, she would be quite all right. Laura was going to have a baby. So that was it. Well, she mustn't shirk. She must get around and do the work in the house so that Manly could get the crops in. So much depended on this year's crops, and there was no money to hire help. Soon Laura was creeping around the house, doing what must be done, and whenever possible, relieving her dizzy head by lying down for a few minutes. The little house grew to look rather dingy, for she couldn't give it the care it had always had. As she went so miserably about her work, she would smile wryly now, and then as she remembered a saying of her mother's, "They that dance must pay the fiddler." Well, she was paying, but she would do the work. She would help that much in spite of everything. The trees were not growing very well. The dry weather of the summer had been hard on them, and they must be given extra care. For years from now, there must be the 10 acres with the right numbers of growing trees in order to prove up on the tree claim and get a title to the land. So Manly plowed around the little trees and then mulched them with manure from the barnyard. Laura missed the drives over the greening prairie and the freshness of early spring. She missed the wild violets that scented the air with a fragrance, but when wild rose time came in June, she was able to ride behind Skip and Barnum along the country roads where the prairie roses on their low bushes made glowing masses of color from pale pink to deepest red, and the air was full of their sweetness. One such drive, she asked abruptly out of a silence, "What shall we name the child?" "We can't name it now," Manly replied, "for we don't know if it will be a boy or a girl." And after another silence, Laura said, "It will be a girl, and we will call her Rose." It rained often that spring. It rained through the summer, and the little trees took courage and waved their little green leaves in the wind while they stretched taller every day. The wild bruised-stemmed grass grew on the high prairie, and the slough grass grew rank in the sloughs where water stood in the lowest places. And oh, how the wheat and oats did grow, for it rained! The days went by and the wheat headed tall and strong and green and beautiful. Then the grain was in the milk, and in just a few days more, the crop would be safe. Even if it turned dry now, there would be a good crop, for the stalks would ripen the wheat. At last, one day, Manly came in from the field. He had been looking it over and decided it was ready to cut. The wheat, he said, was perfect. It would go all of 40 bushels to the acre and be number 1 hard. The price would start at 75 cents a bushel delivered at the elevator in town. "Didn't I tell you," he said, "that everything evens up? The rich had their ice in the summer, but the poor get theirs in the winter." He laughed and Laura laughed with him. It was wonderful. In the morning, Manly had to go to town and buy a new binder to harvest the wheat. He had waited until he was sure there would be a good crop before buying it, for it was expensive, $200, but he would pay half after the grain was threshed and the other half in a second payment after threshing next year. He would only have to pay 8% interest on the deferred payments and could give a chattel mortgage on the machine and cows to secure the debt. Manly went early to town. He wanted to be back in time to begin cutting the grain. Laura was proud when Manly drove into the yard with a new machine. She went out and watched while he hitched on the 4 horses and started for the oat field. The oats were ripest, and he would cut them first. As Laura went back into the house, she did a little mental arithmetic. 100 acres at 40 bushels to an acre would be 4,000 bushels of wheat. 4,000 bushels of wheat at 75 cents a bushel would be, oh, how much would it be? She get her pencil. 4,000 bushels at 75 cents a bushel would be $3,000. It couldn't be. Yes, that was right. Why, they would be rich. She'd say, the poor did get their eyes. They could pay for the mowing machine and the hay rake Manly had bought a year ago and could not pay for because the crop had been so poor. The notes of $75 and $40 and the chattel mortgage on Skip and Barnum would be due after threshing. Laura did not mind the notes so much, but she hated the chattel mortgage on the horses. She'd almost as soon have had a mortgage on Manly. Well, it would soon be paid now, and the note for the sulky plow with its chattel mortgage on the cows. She thought there were some store accounts, but was not sure. They couldn't be much anyway. Perhaps she could have someone to do the work until the baby came. Then she could rest. She needed rest, for not being able to retain her food for more than a few minutes, she had not much to live on and was very emaciated. It would be nice to let someone else do the cooking. The smell of cooking always made her feel so nauseated now. Manly cut the 50 acres of oats with a new McCormick binder that day. He was jubilant at night. It was a wonderful crop of oats, and early tomorrow he would begin on the wheat. But the next morning, when Manly had cut twice around the wheat field, he unhitched and came back to the barn with a team. The wheat would be better for standing a couple of days longer. When he came to cut into it, it was not quite so ripe as he had thought, and he would take no chance of shunking kernels by its being cut a little green, Manly said. But it was even heavier than he had figured, and if it didn't go above 40 bushels to the acre, he was mistaken. Laura felt impatient. She was in a hurry for the wheat to be cut and safely stacked. From the window, she could see the shining new binder standing at the edge of the grain and looked impatient too, she thought. After the end of that day, the DeVoes came by. Cora stopped to spend some time with her husband, Walter, while her husband, Walter, went on to town. The DeVoes were about the same age as Manly and Laura and had been married about as long. Laura and Cora were very good friends, and it was a pleasant afternoon except for being rather uncomfortable from the heat. As the afternoon passed, it grew hotter and there was no wind, which was unusual. It left one gasping for breath and feeling smothered. About 3 o'clock, Manly came in from the barn and said it was going to rain for sure. He was glad he had not been cutting the wheat to have it lie in a rainstorm before he could get it shocked. The sunshine darkened, and the wind sighed and then fell again as it grew darker yet. Then the wind rose a little, and it grew lighter, but the light was a greenish color. Then the storm came. It rained only a little, then hailstones began to fall, at first scattering slowly, then falling thicker and faster while the stones were larger, some of them as large as hens' eggs. Manly and Cora watched from the windows. They could not see far into the rain and the hail, but they saw old Larson, across the road, come to his door and step out. Then they saw him fall, and someone reached out the door, took hold of his feet, and dragged him in. Then the door shut. The fool, Manly said, he got a hailstone in the head. In just 20 minutes, the storm was over, and when they could see as far as the field, the binder was still there, but the wheat was lying flat. It's got the wheat, I guess, Manly said, but Laura could not speak. Then Manly went across the road to find out what had happened to Mr. Larson. When he came back in a few minutes, he said that Mr. Larson had stepped out to pick up a hailstone so large that he wished to measure it. Just as he stooped to pick it up, another one hit him on the head. He was unconscious for several minutes after he was dragged in by the heels, but was all right now except for a sore head. And now let's make some ice cream, Manly said. You stir up, Laura, and I'll gather up hailstones for ice to freeze it. Laura turned to Cora where she stood speechless, looking out of the window. Do you feel like celebrating, Cora? She asked. And Cora answered, No, I want to get home and see what has happened there. The ice cream would choke me. The storm had lasted only 20 minutes, but it left a desolate, rain-drenched and hail-battered world. Unscreened windows were broken. Where there were screens, they were broken and bent. The ground was covered with hailstones so thickly, it looked covered with a sheet of ice, and they even lay in drifts here and there. Leaves and branches were stripped off the young trees, and the sun shone with a feeble, watery light over the wreck. The wreck, thought Laura, of a year's work, of hopes and plans of ease and pleasure. Well, there would be no threshers to cook for. Laura had dreaded the threshing. As Ma used to say, there is no great loss without some small gain. That she should think of so small a gain bothered Laura. She and Cora sat white and silent until Walter drove up to the door, helped Cora into the wagon, and drove away almost forgetting to say goodbye in their anxiety to get home and learn how bad the storm had been there. Manly went out to look at the wheat field and came in sober enough. There is no way to cut, he said. It is all threshed and pounded into the ground. $3,000 worth of wheat planted, and it's the wrong time of the year. Laura was muttering to herself, The poor man gets his... What's that? Manly asked. I was only saying, Laura answered, that the poor man got his ice in the summer this time. At 2 o'clock the next day, hailstones were still lying in drifts in low places. Though plants are wrecked, the pieces must be gathered up and put together again in some shape. Winter was coming. Coal must be bought to last through. That would cost between $60 and $100. Seed grain would have to be bought for next spring's sowing. There were notes of the machinery coming due. There was a binder that had been used to cut only 50 acres of oats. There was the sulky plow and the mower and rake, the seeder that had sown the grain in the spring, and the new wagon. There was too the $500 still due on the building of the house. $500 down in the house. $500 dumped in the house? Laura exclaimed. Oh, I didn't know that. No, Manly said. I didn't think there was any need to bother you about that. But something must be done about all this, and he would go to town tomorrow and see what could be done. Perhaps he could raise money with a mortgage of the homestead. That was proved up upon, thank goodness. He couldn't give a mortgage on the tree claim. That belonged to Uncle Sam until Manly had raised those trees. And Laura thought she could hear her father singing, or Uncle Sam is rich enough to give us all a farm. Sometimes Laura was afraid her head was a little flighty, but that extra $500 debt had been something of a shock. 500 and 200 was 700, and the wagon and the mower. She must stop counting it, or she would have her head queer. Manly found he could renew all his machinery notes for a year by paying the interest. He could even make the first payment on the binder after the next harvest, postponing the second payment to the year after. He could sell all the wild hay he had for $4 a ton delivered at the railroad in town. Buyers wanted it to ship to Chicago. But he could not raise money with a mortgage on the homestead unless they were living on it. He must have money to pay the interest due, for living expenses, and for seed. There was no way to get the money except by moving to the homestead. If they were living on the homestead, he could mortgage it for $800. A newcomer would buy cane and bill for more than Manly had paid for them. Manly would not need them, for he had found a renter for the tree claims on shares. Manly would furnish the seed. Skip and Barnum, with Trixie and Fly to do the driving, could do the work on the one place. If someone else worked the tree claim, Manly could raise more crops on the homestead and have more profit from the farms than if he tried to work both claims all by himself. An addition would have to be built to the homestead claim shanty before they moved, but they could do with one new room and a cellar underneath through using the original shanty for a storeroom. So it was decided. Manly hurried to stack the oats, which Vahela had threshed to the ground, but the oat straw made good animal feed to take the place of hay, and that would leave more hay to sell. When the oats were hauled to the homestead and stacked, Manly dug the hole in the ground for the cellar, and over it built the one-room addition to the claim shanty. Then he built the frame of a barn, cut slough hay, and when it was dry, stacked it around the frame to make a hay barn. Everything was ready now for the moving. Manly and Laura moved to the homestead the next day after the barn was finished. It was the 25th of August, and the winter and summer were the first year.